Hello, and welcome to my Political Parties Function, Structure, and Types lecture. So by the end of this video, you'll be able to identify and explain 4 functions of political parties. You'll be able to understand the role political parties play in the election and nomination process. You'll understand the structure of political parties, and you'll evaluate the key differences of American political parties. So let's start with what a political party is. It's a group that seeks to elect candidates to public office by supplying them with a label, a party identification such as Democrat or Republican, by which they are known to the electorate. I should note before we start that, as I've said, I think previously, that over the last half century, we've seen in general a decline of political parties and more people identifying themselves as independents. So we're going to start with the 4 functions of political parties. The first function is to recruit and nominate candidates for political office, for public office. So political parties will stump for them and raise money for these candidates with the ultimate goal of winning elections. So we're going to drill down into the nominating portion of this function for a few minutes. So in America, this is in general our nomination process for nominating a president. So we have a primary election first, where voters choose the candidate to represent them in the general election. So in the primary election for the Democrats in 2016, it was Hillary Clinton versus Bernie Sanders. And on the Republican side, there were actually 16 people who were all vying for their party's nomination. Then once you have clinched the nomination, you move on to the party convention, which is essentially a political rally where there's it's essentially a formality at this point, where there's lots of speeches. The party releases their party platform. There are a ton of balloons. And if you want to see some really funny photos after this video, you should Google Bill Clinton balloons 2016 election and take a look at those GIFs because he was very excited to see some balloons during the Democratic National Convention in 2016. Then finally, they move on to the general election, where obviously the goal is to win. So we're going to drill down here for a minute into this primary election process and talk about open versus closed primaries. So what I'd like for you to do at the bottom here, you see closed, open, and then top 2. You're going to write down those definitions, and I'm going to talk a little bit here, so just stay with me, okay? So a closed primary is where voters must first be registered party members of a party to vote in its closed primary. So independents typically don't get to vote in these primaries, although parties can opt to invite unaffiliated voters to participate in the primary. States with closed primaries typically tend to have stronger parties, and party leaders tend to favor closed parties because since voters must register with the party first, these party leaders then know which voters will be most receptive to their political message as far as who to target before the general election. On the flip side of that, we have open primaries. In an open primary, anyone can vote regardless of their party affiliation, but you can only vote in one party's primary. So you can't vote in both the Democratic and Republican primary. You have to choose one. One concern with open primaries is that there might be crossover voting. So voters from one party can vote in the other party's primary to try to affect the outcome. So an example of that is if I am a Hillary Clinton supporter and I know that she will be chosen by my state already, I'm not worried about her not winning this primary election, I might go and vote in the Republican primary for Donald Trump because I might think she might have a better chance of beating Donald Trump than she would John Kasich. So that's just one example of a concern that people have with open primaries. But this typically doesn't happen very much, and there's no proof to really say that this crossover voting has really affected any outcomes of an election in any substantial way. The final one that I want you to write down in the bottom right-hand corner there is this idea of top 2. So this is where there's a common ballot that lists all the candidates on one ballot, and the top two vote getters, regardless of their party, go on to the general election. So if a candidate receives at least 50% of the vote, they're directly elected into office. If not, there is a runoff election with the top two finishers. Okay. So let's talk about delegates for a minute. So and we'll talk a little bit more about this when we talk about elections and campaigns as well. But if we're going back here so we just talked about primary elections. Now we're going to move on to party conventions. Okay, that's where the delegates come in. So we have a couple types of delegates. So just a little backstory first. National conventions nominate candidates for president, as I said. And the National Committee selects the time and the place of the National Convention and issues a call for the convention that sets the number of delegates each state has. So the delegates then select the party's nomination at the convention. So there are two types of delegates. So there are pledge delegates. These delegates are awarded through presidential primaries and caucuses with the understanding that they will support a particular candidate at the convention. So when you vote in a primary election, you're actually voting for the delegates that are pledged to your candidate. On the other side of that, there are unpledged delegates. And these delegates, oh, I'm sorry, this is a typo, and I'm just going to change this right here. Give me a second. This should say unpledged. Okay. Sorry. So there are unpledged delegates who are party leaders and elected officials, and they are not committed to vote for any particular candidate. Okay, but they typically tend to follow the lead of the pledged delegates. They usually go the way the pledged delegates go. So in a primary election, you'll see a lot about these delegates and superdelegates. The delegate system, of course, was designed to weaken the power of party bosses because it puts the power back with the people, in that most parties try to choose delegates from lots of different demographics and socioeconomic classes, etc., the pledged delegates, while the superdelegates do tend to be party leaders and elected officials. So you'll hear a lot about this in primary elections, and this is something that you might see, we saw with Clinton and Sanders, that this is how many delegates they needed to win their party's nomination. Again, not the presidency. This is just, trying to get nominated to represent the Democrats. And so she had this many pledged delegates and that many superdelegates, right? Okay. Number 2. So we're back talking about 4 functions of political parties. Number 2 is running political campaigns. And when parties run political campaigns, they typically tend to focus on get out the vote campaigns, right? Registering people to vote. And they also provide their candidate with lists of supporters, polling data, campaign staffers, and all of these nuts and bolts and all of this data that you need to run a political campaign. Political parties also articulate positions on issues. So they appeal to voters based on their party platform. A platform are specific beliefs and values about government. In an attempt to build a coalition. So a coalition is a group of individuals with a common interest. So political parties set the party platform and form coalitions. And finally, political parties critique the policies of the party in power, right? The relationship between major parties ensures that the party who's out of power will keep a close eye on its opponent and notify the public of any wrongdoing or policy missteps. So they essentially serve as watchdogs. So briefly, I want to talk to you about the structure of a political party. So you can read this for yourself. We see that every 4 years there's a national convention. There are national chairpersons for each party. And then it goes down to the state and local level here. you would be tempted to think that this is arranged like a big corporation, right? With the top national convention or national political parties dictating down to the bottom local levels, but that is not the case. These different levels are independent of one another. And while they do coordinate for some activities, there's not a top-down hierarchical system. So you need to know that these political parties at the national, state, and local levels all operate independently of one another. While we're talking about the national chairperson, just an FYI, like the current chairperson for the Democratic National Committee is Tom Perez. And for the Republicans, it's Ramona Romney McDaniel. She is Mitt Romney's niece, and she is currently the chairperson for the RNC. So if we're talking about types of political parties, you all, I think, are pretty familiar with Democrats and Republicans and the differences between them. But what I'd like for you to do is I'd like for you to pause the video, carefully examine the infographic, and just make a T-chart in your notes about Democrats and Republicans. And again, these are vast generalizations on this infographic. But I want you to record one key difference between the left and the right, or Democrats and Republicans, per category. So you see like government, society and culture, family and adults, and then finally beliefs. So go ahead and pause me and do that now, and I'll take this pop-up away so that you can see the entire thing. Finally, after you've finished your T-chart, I want you to choose one of these third parties over here on the right to research briefly. You can go to their website, and in your notes, just record 3 to 5 specific beliefs they have that interest you. Just an FYI, an individual belief is called a plank. And if you go to the part of the website which tells you about the party's platform, that will tell you basically every position that they take on any major position. All right, that's all I have for you. Thanks for watching.